Is it possible to fix all of carbon crediting's problems with an accounting scheme? Probably not, but maybe. And let's examine that right here. Today I want to talk about emissions liability management, and this is an accounting scheme that's being proposed by a bunch of heady academics, mostly at Stanford University, and it's a new way of thinking about how we should be dealing with carbon credits. And it's a really simple approach, and the idea is really just that as a company, you're producing liabilities, carbon liabilities. You're putting carbon into the atmosphere, and that's something that is a liability on your books. You're producing that from traveling, from creating widgets, from computing resources, whatever it is. So you have this set of liabilities that may amount to 1,000 tons a year, and you have to match those liabilities with assets. And assets are basically carbon credits. So the way that this is different than the current approach is that carbon credits are ephemeral. They're temporary. If you're planting a tree, you are removing carbon from the atmosphere, but there's a contract length around how long that tree is going to be legally protected for. Same if you're preserving a forest. Same for pretty much any forest, any carbon credit scheme out there. So your assets, they expire. Your liabilities, they generally don't expire. Now, there are, I think, academic cases that could be made that if you put a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, then over the course of 100 years, it'll, kind of get out of the atmosphere. But in general, your liabilities are never going to expire. Whatever carbon you put in the atmosphere, you're responsible forever. So when you match it to an asset, you have to match it for a period of time. And most carbon credits, for example, represent a period of time of usually 30 to 40 years. And what this means is that when your asset goes, it expires or it goes bad, you have to get a new one. The only exception to this rule is if you're buying carbon credits that are genuine 10,000 year removals. So there are these very rare and exceptional carbon credits from direct air capture machines, from rock weathering, from Egyptian mummies, from biochar, from wood burial. These are carbon credits that are really essentially permanent. So you can wipe out your liability with these very permanent assets. But all the other carbon credit asset classes, they come with an expiration date, and they have to be replaced by the company who's buying the credits once that expiration date has come. So anyone who's dealt with accounting should be familiar with this. So this is not a crazy idea. Companies have liability and asset balancing books all the time. But this is a bit of a revolution for the carbon world, because let's be honest, the way that it works now is you set it and forget it. You buy a ton of CO2 for whatever CO2 you emitted in 2022, and you never think of it again. And a lot of the time, maybe you're claiming that you're carbon neutral in 2022 based on that. Well, we all know that this is not true, right? We all know that when Delta buys a ton of CO2 to offset a flight, either that ton of CO2 has an expiration date, or maybe it may go bad if the trees weren't good, or if the project wasn't good, or if the trees burned down. So we need to stop pretending that the carbon credits we're buying are permanent and just admit the fact that they all come with an expiration date, and that, when that expiration date comes, it's time to replace them. Now, there is a downside here, which is that if a company doesn't care or isn't around 40 years from now when the carbon credits expire, then, what's really to incentivize a company? What is there really to incentivize a company to deal with their carbon emissions from 1986? There isn't much. So there is this requirement that companies do actually match their books over a period of decades, and that's tricky to actually manage. One proposal for them doing this is to create a set of trusts that have money set aside for this each year, and the trust is kind of has a firewall, and their whole goal is to match this in perpetuity. But another way that you can handle this is just by buying more credits up front. So maybe you're buying one set of 40-year credits, for your first 40 years, and maybe you want to double that and buy another 40-year set of credits for the next 40 years. So the credits you buy, they have a time frame in which they're good for. You are welcome to buy more credits today so you can get that 100-year permanence that you may be looking for. So that's the big downside to emissions liability management. The other downside that a company might think exists is that it kind of puts a financial burden on the company, doesn't it? Instead of buying one credit for your 2022 emissions, you now have to buy one credit for 40 years and then buy another credit for another 40 years and keep buying these credits. A company might not necessarily want to do that, but there are a lot of upsides for the company to adopting this type of accounting scheme. So one of the biggest upsides is defensibility, which is that, these carbon credits, they go wrong a lot. I'm sure you're all familiar with all the scandals that have taken place in the carbon markets. And when something goes wrong, traditionally, reporters and the public blame the company who bought those credits and say, you bought these credits and you're greenwashing. I want you to imagine a scenario where we all had a more adult conversation, where a company buys carbon offsets to deal with its 2022 emissions, and instead of just walking away and never having to think about its 2022 emissions again, it's on the line for replacing those offsets if something happens to them. And so, if someone does come along and point out that those offsets aren't real or that the trees actually got cut down, the response from the company wouldn't necessarily be, oh, you caught us greenwashing. It would be that, we have this professional accounting framework. You're right that we bought these credits incorrectly. Our liabilities and assets no longer match, and we'll be buying more assets to make up for it. So that's a much more mature response and conversation that could be had with a reporter or with the public at large. And along with that response, maybe Gucci can also say, we did get duped and we're going to be pursuing litigation against those who sold us fraudulent offsets. That wouldn't be so bad. But there are other benefits to be had for emissions liability management. And one of them is the quality of the carbon offsets themselves. And the reason for that is mostly around the idea of insurance. You see, right now, carbon credits insurance is handled by the registries. So it's handled by the people who are creating the carbon credits to begin with. Verra and American Carbon Registry and others as well create carbon credits, and they tell their customers that they are insuring those products through what they call a buffer pool. They say that whenever something goes wrong with these carbon credits, you can be assured that they'll be replaced by credits in the buffer pool. Well, I've got bad news for you. The buffer pools aren't really an insurance mechanism. Remaster has reviewed over 180 carbon projects at this point. Many of them have severe problems. Many of them have their trees cut down. Many of them are overissued. In only 2 or 3 cases have we ever seen the buffer pool actually used by these registries. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because the people who are actually creating the credits, they shouldn't be running their own insurance schemes. Why on earth would Verra ever want to pay out of its insurance buffer pool? It's not something they'd ever want to do. Credits today are not properly insured. The genius of this is that Verra has convinced credit purchasers that they have the liability when credits go wrong. Verra has convinced them that they are acting as an insurance mechanism. But this is a lie, because at the end of the day, the liability still ends up falling on the company. At the end of the day, reporters are still writing, Bloomberg Green articles and stuff about, how Gucci bought bad credits, right? So, and Delta Airlines is still being sued for buying bad credits. So the liability still rests on the purchaser. But here's the thing. Through emissions liability management, the company is taking responsibility for the duration of their assets. If an asset expires because the trees got cut down, or because a fire raged through the forest, or because Verra created terrible protocols and the credits weren't real to begin with, then you have to replace your credits. And so what's really happening here is that companies are taking responsibility for their own liability. And that makes a lot of sense, because one way or another, the liability does exist with them. Well, what's going to happen when companies start taking liability and fessing up and saying, we bought bad credits, we're on the hook to buy more? What'll happen is that we'll have third-party insurance mechanisms pop up, because no company is going to want to buy credits that they're responsible for replacing if they go wrong without having some insurance mechanism. And third-party insurers are what's required to make sure this market is behaving, because a third-party insurer is not going to insure carbon credits. They're not going to be on the line for purchasing more unless those carbon credits are good. The insurers that are out there, they're going to have to do a lot of diligence to make sure that the carbon credits that they actually insure are good. And in that process, they're going to weed out all of the bad stuff from the market. And, really, a large part of why the quality doesn't exist on the market today is because there isn't a third-party insurance market out there for carbon credits, filtering out the good ones and the bad ones. The good news is that there are several insurers that are popping up. One good example is Kita. They're an insurer that's now offering insurance for carbon credits, but they're fairly new, so we'll have to see where this actually goes. So that's one way in which emissions liability management can act as a driver for improving the quality of credits. The other nice thing is in this idea of permanence. You see, the thing is, we all pretend that credits that we buy from the American Carbon Registry and from Verra, that they last forever. Verra and the American Carbon Registry both make public statements claiming that their credits are worth 100 years. I have bad news for you. Their credits are worth the length of the contract. So if you're buying a 30-year project from Verra, that is the length that your credits are any good. Because after those 30 years pass, the landowner has every right to just cut all those trees down. So Verra makes these very false claims that their credits are somehow good for 100 years, but that's not backed up by any true mechanism. There's no mechanism to stop deforestation once the contract length ends, and there's no mechanism to replace these credits once the contract ends. And let's think about this intuitively. How would that even work? You've got a 30-year project, it expires. Verra claims that its credits are somehow worth 100 years, even though they've only signed a contract with the landowner for 30 years. How are they going to replace that? How are they going to make up for that 70-year gap? They might claim that they're going to do so by taking credits out of their buffer pool, but that's just intuitively not going to make sense. The buffer pool makes up 10 to 20% of the credit issuance on their platform. The only way that they could ever have a buffer pool big enough is if they continuously expand the size of their crediting schemes infinitely. The only way that Verra can actually provide a 100-year guarantee on their credits is a Ponzi scheme. But the reality is a lot of these projects are only a couple years away from expiring, and in some cases we're less than 2 years away from the brand new Guardian article that says that, some company bought credits whose contract length expired and they cut all the trees down. Once again, this is a problem that is solved through emissions liability management. But to really understand why this permanence point is important, we have to go a level deeper into carbon philosophy. You see, as I've explained, the American Carbon Registry and Verra projects, they are not actually offering 100 years worth of emissions reductions. They're offering, 20 to 40 years worth of emissions reductions depending on their contract length. There are registries out there that do sign 100-year contracts. So the California Air Resource Board makes you sign 100-year contracts. And to be clear, the American Carbon Registry does issue California Air Resource Board credits that are 100 years, but I'm talking about their voluntary program. And Climate Action Reserve is another registry that has 100-year projects. So that's great, right? There are these solutions for long-term credits, right? But it's actually not that great, because forest conservation as a concept, it doesn't make much sense on 100-year timescales. And the reason for that is that I would never trust someone to actually, uphold a contract to protect their forest for 100 years, especially if they were the kind of person who wanted to cut their trees to begin with. A lot of these projects are taking place in the developing world. Maybe the legalities are vague there. Maybe there's, inherent political risk. So there's a problem with long-term contracts, but there's a flip side to that as well. From a landowner perspective, there's really no reason that you should ever sign a 100-year contract, even if you really want to do great for the environment. And this is the reason for it. When you sign a 100-year contract, the value of your land tanks to almost nothing. You're putting an easement on your land that prevents you or any of your descendants from ever developing that land, harvesting timber off that land, whatever it is. You are destroying the value of the land that you own. But there's even greater downsides to 100-year contracts, which is that generally, there are two types of landowners in the world. There are those who have no qualms about cutting all their trees down, and there are those who want to protect their trees. They're bleeding heart liberals, they're land trusts, whoever they happen to be. Those who really want to protect their trees, they're happy to sign the contract, but their trees were never at risk to begin with. Those who really don't want to protect the trees, they just want the money, they're never going to sign up for 100 years. So the situation that's occurred is that a lot of the carbon credits that are being issued today under these 100-year-long programs are being issued to people and to forests that were never really at risk to begin with, because these are forests that were basically already protected under some other scheme. And so this poses a real problem for carbon credit quality. If you have a 100-year contract, you're probably not going to get the greatest quality credits. So we got all these problems with these long-term contracts, right? The solution then is to sign shorter contracts, right? 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, whatever it happens to be. Well, if you do that, then your credits aren't worth as much in terms of your claims. And there's two ways to deal with that. The first way is emissions liability management, which is what I'm advocating for in this video. That is to say that the end buyer, buys these credits for whatever length of term the contract is good for, and when the contract is up, it's time to buy more credits for your 2022 emissions. The other approach to dealing with this is an approach called ton-year accounting. So mathematically and I guess scientifically speaking, we do have ways of computing the 100-year value of shorter term credits, right? So we can say Farmer Joe signed a 20-year contract, here's the 100-year value of that work. And the way that we do that is basically by issuing Farmer Joe fewer credits. You sign a 20-year contract, the 100-year value means that you're getting a fifth of the credits that you're supposed to be getting. But here's the thing, that may work out. You may get your 100 years worth of carbon that way. But the burden under that scenario, under ton-year accounting, is being placed on the landowner. So the landowner now has to sign a shorter contract, and in exchange, they're getting a lot fewer credits. And this all of a sudden makes it a lot more difficult for the landowner to, make any profit this way. Here's where we get philosophical. Under emissions liability management, the end purchaser, the company, is taking responsibility for doing something about their emissions liabilities after the credits expire. The end purchaser is responsible for filling out those 100 years worth of assets. Under ton-year accounting, the farmer on the ground who owns the forest is taking responsibility for that 100 years, and they're taking a responsibility either by signing a 100-year contract or by taking a huge loss, a huge deduction in the number of credits that they're issuing. Now, just on the surface, which one of these two groups should really be taking this responsibility? It's the company who's created the emissions, right? It's not the farmer on the ground. And if we want these carbon programs to ever work, it's got to be the company that takes the responsibility, because the finances behind ton-year accounting, when done conservatively, are pretty grim. Farmers don't get paid very much money. But here's the thing, here's the bright side. If companies do retake responsibility for replacing their credits every 20 years or whatever it happens to be, credits will presumably get a little cheaper. Credits right now under this 100-year contract length under the California Air Resource Board are selling for about $16 a ton. But if we were to make those contracts 25 years, that would probably go down, and it might shrink down to like $5 or $6 a ton. So definitely you can reduce the cost of these credits if you're just willing to accept shorter term contracts and spread that cost out over many years. Just to wrap up the philosophical deep dive of this video, emissions liability management, by forcing companies to rebuy credits after they expire, it's going to improve the quality of credits, because right now a lot of the people signing up for carbon credits, they're parks, they're land trusts, they're old hippies who live in the woods who never would have cut their trees down and have signed an easement to prevent that anyway. So what emissions liability management is really doing is allowing credits to get better by allowing us to sign short-term contracts with farmers and landowners who really would have cut their trees down. Here's the thing about emissions liability management, though. It is complicated. Emissions liability management generally is going to require companies to keep some sort of team of experts to make sure that the carbon credits that they buy, they haven't expired yet, or they haven't experienced a reversal, or there's going to be constant maintenance on the credits. So that's complicated, right? And companies don't want to do that. Well, there is a company out there that I think is kind of offering something pretty similar to emissions liability management as a product. And that's called Rubicon. Rubicon offers something called a Rubicon credit ton. And what they're actually doing is they have their own emissions liability management scheme in the back end. They're buying a bunch of credits from projects. Those projects have expiration dates. Those projects could go bad. Those projects, maybe their credits aren't worth a full ton. And they're doing then a bunch of math to make sure that, on the front end, they're actually offering a ton of carbon that lasts for, 100 years. And the nice thing about this is that Rubicon as a company is now taking the burden of doing portfolio rebalancing off of your company. No longer does every company need to employ a climate scientist to make sure that these carbon credits that they're buying are real. And the other nice thing about this approach is that, through Rubicon's approach and through emissions liability management in general, we can take all of these bad credits that are on the market today, the ones that are about to expire, the ones that aren't actually worth 1 ton, but are actually worth 300 kilograms or something, and we can make up for that by rebalancing the portfolio. So all of these bad credits that have been issued, which are in some cases very kind of good projects, but just have gotten too many credits or are about to expire, they can still be used in a portfolio that lasts 100 years, as long as we just acknowledge that we have to buy more when they expire, or that, sometimes the portfolio is going to have to be rebalanced. Now, this is not a personal endorsement of Rubicon. Full disclosure, they are a customer of my company's, but, I think what they're doing is great. I think what they're doing is the closest thing on the market today to offering emissions liability management. But I would like to see more details from them about how they're actually doing that portfolio balancing to make sure that they're actually getting the numbers right. The last nice benefit that I want to talk about with emissions liability management is that it seems like it might be a little bit more compliant with the kind of systems that are being created by the regulatory environments today. And what I mean by that is that, for example, the VCMI, which is one of these gigantic regulatory bodies for carbon emissions, has recently come out and said you shouldn't use carbon credits to say that you're carbon neutral. And they're right. But under emissions liability management, what you're actually saying is that, you are handling your liabilities and, as of today, you're carbon neutral and you'll keep that account balanced into the indefinite future. So it's a more sophisticated argument. And although I really hate digging through these alphabet soup regulatory agencies, it sounds as if emissions liability management could kind of jive with what the VCMI wants people to do about carbon credits. So there's that too, although I really hate diving into these things. Finally, I want to give a shout out to the original paper. Emissions liability management as a scheme has kind of only been around for about 6 months now, and it's mostly being sponsored by a group at Stanford. A lot of the work has been done by Mark Roston and Alicia Seeger. You can go and read their paper. I think their paper includes some elements that I don't necessarily think are important for emissions liability management. It's got some weird stuff, like only demanding that people buy removals credits. I don't see what that has to do with emissions liability management, and I don't think that's... And I don't think that there's any need to exclude avoided emissions at all. I mean, 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere is a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. Whatever. And, just to wrap things up, emissions liability management, it offers a lot to the carbon world. It offers defensibility to those buying credits because they're able to have a more nuanced conversation when something goes wrong. It offers increases in quality of the carbon credits through better insurance mechanisms and through better contract terms for landowners. It could potentially reduce the cost of carbon crediting, or at least spread that cost over a longer period. And it generally handles permanence a lot better than what's being handled today, which is basically Vera and the American Carbon Registry lying about their credits being worth something more than 20 years from now. So I encourage you to look into emissions liability management. Maybe that's the solution to all our problems.